Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Midnight Musings. My name is Ron Guth, and these are the things that keep me up at night. I haven't done a Midnight Musings for a couple of weeks, mostly because nothing's been keeping me up. It's a good time of the year, things are going well. But tonight I got to thinking about this stimulus bill that Congress is considering, and I'm very concerned about the amount of money that we're going to be adding to the national debt. When you think about the national debt, it's something that every American is responsible for, not necessarily every American having to come up with the money, but at some point, our whole society is going to suffer because of this tremendous debt that we have and that we've accumulated. The total amount of the stimulus bill earlier this year was $2.3 trillion, and that gave every American, I should say every tax-paying American, $1,200. Now, that was only for families that had a household income of below $75,000, so not every taxpayer got it, but every American is on the hook for paying for it. This new bill is offering a $600 check, and that may increase depending on how the Congress battles it out. But right now, it's starting out at $600. Trump is trying to get $2,000 for each taxpayer in exchange for cutting some of the pork in the bill. However, no matter whether it's $600 or $2,000, and no matter who gets it, someone is going to have to pay it. And they're estimating that this stimulus bill is going to be somewhere around $1 trillion, possibly even more. Now, when you think of the national debt, which is right now about $27 trillion, who pays for it? Well, currently, we're funding it by borrowing money. We sell treasury notes to foreign nations, and they help us fund this debt. Unfortunately, the debt keeps getting bigger and bigger. A good website to help understand how all this stuff works together is usdebtclock.org. I looked at the website tonight, and that's really what motivated me to do this video, is because the numbers are just so outrageous. So I'm going to give you a screenshot of usdebtclock.org that I took a few minutes ago, and I'll go through some of the numbers. So here we go. In the upper left is the U.S. national debt, and you can see that number is $27.5 trillion and increasing. If you look at the static page, it looks pretty flat, but when you go to the website and you see the live page, these numbers are just cranking up on almost every segment of that page, on every item of information. So the U.S. national debt is $27.5 trillion, and that means, if you look right next to it, it says the debt per citizen is $83,000. Now, that doesn't mean every taxpayer. It means every man, woman, and child. If they were to have to pay the debt today, they would have to each come up with $83,000. So if you have a 1-year-old, if you have a 90-year-old, someone who's retired, it doesn't matter. Every citizen in America has to come up with $83,000. We all know that not everybody pays the debt. I mean, the debt is paid by taxpayers primarily. Or if they're going to come after people, they're going to come after the people that are working, and these are the people that file taxes. In America, we have roughly 125 million people that are filing taxes, but not all of them pay taxes. What I read earlier was something like 57% of taxpayers pay no taxes. However, if you look at this number in the U.S. national debt area up here, the debt per taxpayer is $220,000. And what that means, again, is if we have to pay this debt and they come after the taxpayers, we would each have to come up with $220,000. That is just a stunning number. And that's the first time I've seen that. I knew that years ago, we were each on the hook for like $20,000 or $30,000, but now we're on the hook for $220,000, which is just outrageous. When you look at the federal debt to GDP ratio at the bottom of that same section, that's a very interesting analysis there. In 1960, the federal debt was roughly 52% of the gross domestic product. The gross domestic product is the sum of all goods produced by Americans in a particular year. In 1980, 34% of the GDP went to debt. So that was good because you can see it went down from 52% to 34%, so we're going in the right direction. Well, by 2000, that we'd reversed course again, and suddenly the federal debt represented 55% of the GDP, which meant more than half the money that we were making every year was going to debt. Now, if you look at the 2020, it's off the charts. It's 128.9%. What that means is that we're paying more for debt than we actually make in a particular year, and that's a very dangerous situation to be in. For example, if your household made $100,000 a year, but you were incurring $128,000 in debt, you obviously could not sustain that for very long. In American households that live under those situations are called bankrupt, and they are forced into bankruptcy. They are not allowed to continue to go into deficit spending for the rest of their life. Unfortunately, the U.S. government does not have that sort of restriction on it. They continue to spend and spend more than they make, and that's why each taxpayer is on the hook for $220,000. Now, there's a couple other interesting things on here. If you look in the section where it says the largest budget items, it's a tiny little section just underneath the U.S. national debt. You see a couple interesting things there. Like the U.S. total interest paid this year is roughly $3.9 trillion. And that represents $15,000 for every adult. So that's a big number. That's a number that we're each responsible for. Maybe not today, but someday down the road, we're going to have to come up with it. The savings per family on the right there is a good sign. We each have 29,368. If you hover over the section with your mouse, it says that the liquid cash in personal savings for all U.S. families divided by the number of U.S. families. So that's a good thing. So there's a lot of cash sitting out there. So we might have $29,000 per family, but that doesn't cover the $220,000 per taxpayer that someday we're going to owe. Another interesting item in that same section at the bottom there is the student loan debt. That stands right now at $1.7 trillion, which means that every student graduating from college before they get their first job has an average loan due of $39,930. That's a big burden to put on a student right before they start working, and it's going to take them a long time to pay that off. If you look in the lower right section with a gray tint on it, in the upper left, it shows the U.S. population at 330,758,000 people. Of those, only 125,000, it shows right below that, are taxpayers. Here's one other interesting figure, and this shows you the disconnect between what we call the budget and what actual spending turns out to be. In other words, if you're busting the budget, this is what it looks like. And this is shown in the upper left section under U.S. federal spending official. That is the amount that's budgeted and appropriated for by the Congress and approved by the president. That shows $6.7 billion. Now, right below that is the actual, which is $7.8 trillion, which is over $1.1 trillion more than what is actually budgeted. And the same thing with the deficit. If you look at the U.S. federal deficit official, this is what has been, on paper, $3.2 trillion, but the actual deficit is $4.3 trillion. So that's, again, is $1.1 trillion more than expected, and that gets added to the national debt every year. That's why we anticipate that by the end of 2021, the national debt will probably be somewhere around $30 trillion. So if you divide that by the total population of America, it looks like the debt per citizen is going to be approaching $100,000. Now, why is this happening? If you look at the so-called stimulus bill that Congress is fighting about right now, it's been called a COVID relief bill. Well, that's really not true. What it is an omnibus spending bill. And what that means is instead of hammering out a budget every year, in which case, people set their limits and they say this is all we're going to spend and we're going to try to control spending, that stuff doesn't happen anymore. If you remember years ago, there was an annual fight every year over the budget. The Democrats would propose a budget, the president would propose a budget, the Republicans would propose a budget, and they would hammer it out and come up with something that everybody could live with. Well, now that's not the case. They have what they call an omnibus spending bill, which is where they just put everything into this huge bill and they pass it, and there's stuff in there that is just outrageous. You've seen reports on some of the things that are in this omnibus spending bill. But what's happened this time is that people are so desperate for that $600 check that they're willing to swallow any bitter pill to get that money, and they are willing to pass that omnibus spending bill uh, just to get the $600 check. What President Trump is proposing is let's raise the stimulus check to $2,000, which the Democrats are all happy to do, but Trump wants them to cut pork and pay for it that way instead of just spending more money. And unfortunately, the Democrats are going to fight that tooth and nail. So we'll see what eventually comes out. But no matter what happens, no matter what bill is finally approved, what stimulus check amount is finally approved, it is going to be adding to the national debt. And that's what needs to keep us up at night. If you're concerned about having to come up with $220,000 as a taxpayer, you need to be calling your congressman, your senator, and tell them to stop this crazy spending. Rein in the spending. I know we're in a very tough time now with COVID, but we still have to pay the bill someday. And we're either going to pay it by taxing taxpayers more heavily or by printing money, which means that someday we're just going to have this outrageous inflation. Anyway, thank you for viewing. If you're interested in this video and more like it, please hit the subscribe button and click the notification bell so that whenever I post a new video, you'll be made aware of it. It's getting late, so I'm going to sign off and say good night.